Mark, it's good to see you again. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure. I'd like to discuss some of your books. So the first one I'd like to speak a little bit more about, and I have some questions for you, is the one you wrote called An End to Upside Down Thinking, Dispelling the Myth that the Brain Produces Consciousness and the Implications for Everyday Life, which you published in 2018. And as far as I could tell from that, the core kind of subject of that was consciousness is fundamental. And when you understand it, it can overturn some of our biggest fears. Would that be fair?
Yes, another way I would put it is it's more about falsifying the idea that consciousness comes from the material world. I do pose this alternative that if consciousness doesn't come from the material world, more specifically, if it does not emerge out of the physical brain, then perhaps consciousness is the fundamental substrate of reality. As Max Planck said in 1931, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. So
That's
that's the notion of upside down thinking. But I want to give a caveat to you and your audience because I've become more and more sensitive to this as I've written more and looked at these topics more.
yeah.
I feel most comfortable with the falsification of an existing idea versus saying, I know with certainty this is the truth.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
I end up in a place of saying, well, I know it's not that, but what it is exactly, I'm not sure. So in this discussion, I'm sure we'll talk about the idea that maybe consciousness is fundamental,
Yeah.
and perhaps that's true to some degree, but it could be way more complex than that.
I'd agree with you 100%. The further down I've gone down various tracks, I realize that it's definitely not that, but as to what it is, I'm not really sure at this point. Yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic. So, question number one for you. In your mind, in the research you've done, what is the single most compelling piece of evidence, whether it's from near-death experiences, psychic phenomena, quantum physics, or anything else, that made you think that the brain is a receiver as a model?
I'll give two answers. The first answer is it's an aggregate of data. And that's why I had to write a book and into upside down thinking, because it wasn't one that made me say, oh, I know with certainty
Yeah.
consciousness isn't coming from the brain and the brain is somehow interfacing with it. But that said, I will give one example that I'm thinking of at first.
Mhm.
It's the veridical out of body experience in the near death experience.
Hmm.
And this actually makes the brain look like a filtering mechanism of consciousness rather than just a receiver. It might
Yeah.
have a receiver mechanism, but maybe the brain's actually getting in the way of a broader consciousness. And when you get the brain out of the way, everything's exposed, almost like removing a blindfold.
Hmm.
And the reason I say that with regard to this out of body experience is when a person's in a state of clinical death or close to it, let's say cardiac arrest, blood stops flowing to the brain, person is in major physiological trouble, they often describe being outside their body.
Hmm.
This is after they're resuscitated. And in these veridical out of body experiences, what they perceive while outside the body, meaning they heard something or they saw something from a vantage point, from above the body, maybe in another room, they
Hmm.
come back in their body and they are able to tell the doctor or family members or staff at the hospital what they saw and heard.
Hmm.
And those people who are not in a near-death state can say, that's correct. How could that be?
Yeah.
From a vantage point outside your body, number one, but also at a time when your brain should never have been able to produce something that was accurate. And the key here is that if the perception is verified, that's what the word veridical means. If it's a verified memory, then it's not a hallucination.
Yeah.
So we have a non-hallucinatory consciousness that's very vivid and accurate at a time when the brain is barely functioning or completely off. This is functional consciousness, enriched consciousness with little or no brain. This is very destructive to the materialist paradigm that the brain is what's creating consciousness. And just to preempt the skeptics, there is this counter argument sometimes, which is, well, there have been studies that measure there's a spike in brain activity in this little area after someone has died. We see the brain spiking a little bit. The question becomes, can that little spike can that explain the extent of what happens in a near-death experience? There's so much that happens, and you'd have to explain how that spike creates a veridical out-of-body experience, for example, verified memory from outside the body. There's no physiological explanation for that in neuroscience currently.
Mhm. That's interesting. I've studied the near-death experiences quite a lot. I found that very interesting. And the further I went, it just makes so much sense that something else is going on completely.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So you came from a high achieving, very, what I would consider to be a rational background. It was in finance, wasn't it?
Yes, finance and strategy consulting, so the
Yeah.
business world.
Yeah. Okay. So what did it feel like to you, just on a personal level, to realize that the world you thought you knew, the materialist model, if you will, was fundamentally incorrect as you came across this new information?
Mind blowing, disorienting, isolating. This was 2016,
Yeah.
9 years ago.
Yeah.
Life changing. I
Yeah.
feel like the version of me before learning about this died in many ways. And it's like a rebirth. Not that there haven't been other rebirths
Yeah.
since then, but this paradigm shift for me, this was my entryway into questioning reality. Because I used to believe life was random and meaningless, and that's what science told us. And now I don't think it's random, and I think it's meaningful.
Yeah.
How the non-randomness works and what exactly the meaning is, I'm still asking. But it's a mystical world
Yeah.
always, but once we get on this path, it becomes more and more notably mystical.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay, that's brilliant. So if the listener to this accepts the idea that their consciousness isn't tied to their physical body, what do you think is the most profound practical change they might expect in how they approach, for example, the fear of death or the fear of loss of a loved one?
My guess is they would fear death less. That's been my experience. When I've talked to many other people, it's less of a conscious fear. The body still might hold on to it because it is in a survival mode, but
Hmm.
psychologically there's a shift. What I have found is that this worldview doesn't necessarily make the suffering and pain of the body any easier. It can contextualize it in a new way sometimes, but there are still challenges that occur in life.
Okay, cool. Earlier on, you mentioned a filter metaphor. How do you think the brain can restrict our perception? And what are some simple practices perhaps a person could use to occasionally loosen that filter and experience a broader reality?
The way I think about reality now is that we are viewing life through a very narrow band. And there are other TV stations, so to speak,
Mm.
that could be tuned into. Maybe the dream space or dream spaces are some. The near death experience seems to take people into specific types of experiences, psychedelics. And
Mm.
depending on the substance taken, for example, people who take DMT describe a very similar type world where there are machine elves that they encounter, whereas other substances might describe different worlds. Meditation. There are ways of altering our state of consciousness, breathing exercises, certain types of movements like Qigong. And what I found is that each person seems to have a different blueprint where certain practices are
Yeah.
more useful to them. And even at different times in their life, they might resonate with one thing, and then a few years later, that doesn't work for them and they need something new.
Mm. Okay, that's really interesting. Is there something that works particularly well for you, or has your journey been like mine, which is the initial stuff now that has no relevance and I'm onto new things all the time?
It feels like that.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll tap back into older things. I'll remember them and realize their relevance, but it's
Mm.
constantly evolving. And I kind of feel like I don't know what's going on at all. What is life? What we think we know, we think we can control,
No.
but it's too weird.
Yeah, no, I get that. In fact, the more I study this and the more I experience my life, the more I realize I know absolutely nothing about anything. Yeah,
I don't.
cool. No,
But I think there are things we can falsify
yeah,
because a specific model is presented and we can show how it's not true. So I do think that the set of truths that used to exist for me, it's narrower. But within those possible truths, I don't know.
yeah, gotcha, gotcha. That's cool, that's cool. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this before we draw this topic to a close?
I would just say that there seems to be two different approaches to getting to the topics we're discussing. One is through direct experience, and I mentioned different ways that people get there, and another is through the intellect. And the intellectual path, which is a lot of where I started, is slow. Whereas someone who has a near-death experience, they know because they experienced it directly and their life is forever changed. So because we're having this conversation, it's inherently of the intellect in a way. So anyone listening to it, if this is your first experience with some of these topics, I would say it's like the door is open a little bit.
Hmm.
And over time, with more and more exposure to this material, it becomes more embodied.
Hmm.
And for me, it required a lot of research to get to the point where I couldn't go back to my old worldview.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so if someone's interested in this topic, you have a website, don't you, with your books listed and everything. What is that website, please, Mark?
It's my name, markgober.com. markgober.com, markgober.com.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.